The black granite letters caught the morning light like tears that never fell. Captain Eliza Raven walked past the memorial wall at Black Ridge Base every day for 3 years, her boots echoing against the concrete in a rhythm that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. She never stopped to read the names etched into the stone. There were too many, and most days she didn't have the luxury of grief. At 28, Eliza had already earned a reputation as one of the finest forward operatives in special reconnaissance. She could disappear into hostile territory for months, survive on nothing but instinct and willpower, and return with intelligence that saved lives. Her commanding officer, General Morrison, often said she was built differently, carved from granite herself, unbreakable and relentless. The morning routine at Black Ridge never changed. 0500 hours formation, briefings in the war room, equipment checks, and training exercises that push soldiers to their limits. Eliza thrived in this environment, where precision meant survival and hesitation meant death. She'd grown up in rural Montana, the daughter of a rancher who taught her that the land didn't forgive mistakes. The military had simply expanded that lesson to include the entire world. Our unit, Delta Company, specialized in deep reconnaissance missions, the kind that didn't officially exist on any paperwork. They hunted targets that had no names, carried orders that were never written down, and operated in territories that weren't supposed to be on any map. It was dangerous work, but it was work that mattered. Every mission they completed meant fewer American soldiers would die in conventional warfare. Technical Sergeant Jules Martinez had been monitoring communications at Black Ridge for 8 years. He was the kind of soldier who found comfort in the steady hum of electronics and the predictable patterns of encrypted signals. In his mid-30s, with graying temples and chronic insomnia, Jules had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect anomalies in radio traffic. He could spot a security breach from the subtle shift in frequency patterns, identify enemy communications from the rhythm of their transmissions. Jules had watched Eliza prepare for dozens of missions over the years. He'd seen her check equipment with methodical precision, memorize maps until she could navigate hostile terrain blindfolded, and maintain her composure under pressure that would break most people. There was something about her that reminded him of his own sister, the same fierce determination, the same refusal to accept limitations that others tried to impose. The morning of her final mission, Eliza had stopped by the communications room to test her radio equipment. Jules remembered the conversation clearly, though he'd never told anyone about it. She'd been quieter than usual, more contemplative. "Martinez," she'd said, adjusting the frequency on her headset. "If something happens out there, if communications go dark, keep monitoring Channel 7. Sometimes echoes bounce around for years before they find their way home." At the time, Jules had assumed she was being philosophical. Forward operatives often developed superstitions about communication protocols, little rituals that helped them feel connected to base when they were operating alone in enemy territory. He'd simply nodded and promised to keep the channel active. The Kashmir Corridor mission had been classified beyond classification. Even now, 3 years later, most personnel at Black Ridge knew only fragments of what had happened. A deep reconnaissance operation into territory that didn't officially exist. Intelligence suggested a high-value target was coordinating terrorist activities from a compound hidden in the mountains. Eliza and her 3-person team had been tasked with confirming the target's presence and gathering intelligence for a larger operation. The team had inserted at night, using a helicopter that officially never took off. The last confirmed communication had come 18 hours later, a brief status report indicating they'd reached the target area and were beginning surveillance. After that, silence. Search and rescue operations had been impossible. The terrain was too dangerous, the political situation too sensitive, and the mission too classified to risk additional exposure. A reconnaissance drone had eventually located debris near the landing zone: torn fabric, blood-stained equipment, and a single patch from Eliza's uniform. The analysis had been conclusive. The team had been killed in action. General Morrison had delivered the news personally to the families. 3 soldiers lost in service to their country in an operation that couldn't be acknowledged or honored publicly. Their names had been added to the memorial wall, their files sealed and then incinerated in a ceremony that no one attended. But Jules had noticed something that everyone else missed. In the weeks following the mission, he detected strange signals on the encrypted frequencies, brief, untraceable pings that appeared and disappeared like digital ghosts. Solar flares, atmospheric interference, equipment malfunctions. There were a dozen explanations for random signals in the electromagnetic spectrum, but these weren't random. They followed patterns, repeated at specific intervals, and always appeared on channels that had been assigned to Eliza's unit. Most technicians would have dismissed them as system noise. Jules couldn't. He'd spent too many years listening to the rhythm of military communications, learning to distinguish between genuine signals and background static. These pings were different. They were purposeful. He'd started keeping a log, documenting every anomaly, every fragment of signal that didn't belong. His superiors occasionally asked about his work, but technical maintenance was considered routine. As long as communications remained reliable, no one questioned Jules's methods or his attention to detail. The log had grown over 3 years. Hundreds of entries, patterns within patterns, fragments of data that refused to fit into any conventional explanation. Jules had begun to suspect that the signals weren't random at all, that someone, somewhere, was trying to communicate using frequencies that were supposed to be inactive. But he'd never voiced his suspicions. Dead soldiers didn't send radio signals. Mission failures weren't reversed by wishful thinking. And Technical Sergeant Martinez had a reputation for reliability, not conspiracy theories. Until the night everything changed. It was 0400 hours on a Tuesday morning. Jules was alone in the communications room, monitoring routine traffic between Black Ridge and other military installations. The base was quiet except for the minimal overnight security presence and the distant hum of generators. He'd been working the night shift for 6 months, preferring the solitude to the chaos of daytime operations. The signal came without warning, cutting through the encrypted channels like a blade through silk. Not a ping this time, not a fragment of data, but a voice. Clear, professional, unmistakable. Raven 49er returning. Black Ridge grid. 5 minutes. Jules dropped his coffee mug. The ceramic shattered against the concrete floor, fragments scattering across the room like his understanding of reality. That call sign had been deactivated the day Eliza was declared dead. The frequency had been scrubbed from active channels. The voice pattern had been archived and sealed. But there it was, speaking from 7 years of silence, calm and steady as bedrock. Eliza's voice, speaking from the dead. Jules stared at the radio equipment as if it had transformed into something alien and threatening. His hands trembled as he reached for the frequency controls, fine-tuning the reception to eliminate any possibility of interference. The signal was gone, but the silence felt different, now charged with possibility and terror in equal measure. He'd heard that voice 1,000 times before. Briefing missions, calling in airstrikes, requesting extraction from hostile territory. Always calm, always professional, always alive. But Captain Eliza Raven had been dead for 7 years. Her body had never been recovered, but the evidence had been conclusive. Blood evidence, torn uniform, witness accounts from intelligence assets who'd observed the firefight from a distance. Jules rewound the digital recording system, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The voice pattern analysis would take 30 seconds that felt like 30 years. He'd run similar tests before, comparing the mysterious signals to archived audio files, but they'd never been clear enough for conclusive identification. This time was different. This time, he had a complete transmission. The analysis results appeared on his screen. 98.6% match. Voice pattern recognition, frequency analysis, even the subtle accent markers that made each person's speech as unique as a fingerprint. Every parameter confirmed. What his heart already knew. "It's her," he whispered to the empty room. "Dear God, it's really her." The impossibility of it hit him like a physical blow. 7 years of believing she was gone, of carrying the weight of her absence, of wondering what had happened in those final moments in the Kashmir corridor. 7 years of maintaining a digital vigil the command had never noticed and never questioned. Jules reached for the emergency phone, his training overriding his shock. The duty officer needed to be notified immediately. Security protocols demanded it. But his hand hesitated over the receiver as the implications began to sink in. If Eliza was alive, where had she been for 7 years? If she'd survived the Kashmir operation, why hadn't she made contact sooner? And if she was returning now, what had changed? The duty officer on shift was Lieutenant Carson, a recent graduate from the military academy who'd been assigned to Black Ridge only 6 months earlier. He was competent but inexperienced, the kind of officer who followed regulations. Precisely because he hadn't yet learned which rules could be bent and which ones would break you. "Lieutenant Carson, this is Technical Sergeant Martinez in Communications. I need you to report to the comm center immediately. Priority Alpha." Carson's voice crackled through the intercom with the crisp authority of someone who'd been trained to project confidence, even when he felt none. "What's the nature of the emergency, Sergeant?" Jules hesitated. How do you explain that a dead woman had just announced her return from the grave? How do you convince a skeptical young officer that the impossible had just walked through there? "Electronic front door?" "Sir, I've received a transmission on a deactivated frequency. Call sign Raven 49er. The voice pattern analysis shows." He paused, knowing how insane the words would sound. "It shows a match with Captain Eliza Raven." The silence stretched long enough for Jules to wonder if the intercom had malfunctioned. When Carson finally responded, his voice carried the careful tone of someone addressing a potentially unstable subordinate. "Sergeant Martinez, Captain Raven has been deceased for 7 years. You're aware of this, correct?" "Yes, sir." "I'm also aware that I just recorded her voice requesting clearance to land at this facility." Another pause, shorter this time. Jules could almost hear the gears turning in Carson's mind, weighing the possibilities. Equipment malfunction, psychological breakdown, elaborate hoax, all more plausible than resurrection. "I'll be down in 5 minutes. Don't touch anything until I arrive." Jules set the phone down and stared at the radio equipment. The frequencies remained silent, but he could feel something building in that silence, a tension that reminded him of the moments before a thunderstorm, when the air itself seemed to hold its breath. He'd spent 8 years monitoring communications at Black Ridge, learning to distinguish between routine traffic and genuine emergencies. This felt different from anything he'd experienced before. Not just the content of the transmission, but the way it had cut through the encrypted channels with surgical precision. Whoever had sent that signal knew exactly which frequencies to use, which protocols to follow, and which call signs would get attention. Lieutenant Carson arrived exactly 5 minutes later, his uniform crisp despite the early hour. He was 25 years old, with the kind of earnest competence that reminded Jules of his younger self. Carson had been assigned to Black Ridge as part of his advanced training, rotating through different departments to gain experience in military operations. "Show me what you've got, Sergeant." Jules replayed the transmission, watching Carson's face for any sign of recognition or understanding. The young officer listened intently, his expression shifting from skepticism to confusion to something that might have been fear. "Run the voice analysis again," Carson ordered. Jules complied, knowing the results would be identical. The computer processed the audio file with mechanical precision, comparing wave patterns and frequency distributions against the archived database. The results appeared on screen. 98.6% match. Statistical certainty within acceptable parameters. Carson studied the readout for a long moment, his training warring with his common sense. Finally, he reached for the secure phone line that connected directly to the base commander's office. "This is Lieutenant Carson. I need to speak with General Morrison immediately." "Yes, I understand the hour. This is a priority alpha situation." The conversation that followed was brief and one-sided. Jules could hear only Carson's responses, but he could piece together the general's questions from the context. "No, sir. This is not a drill." "Yes, sir. I've confirmed the voice analysis." "No, sir, I don't have an explanation." Carson hung up and turned to Jules with the expression of someone who just received orders he didn't fully understand. "General Morrison is en route. He wants the facility placed under security alert, but no sirens, no announcements. And he wants you to maintain monitoring on all frequencies until further notice." Jules nodded, understanding the implications. If this was genuine, if Eliza was truly returning, then security protocols demanded they prepare for anything. She could be compromised, turned, or carrying intelligence that could compromise the entire base. On the other hand, if this was some kind of elaborate deception, then they were dealing with an enemy who knew far too much about their internal operations. The radio crackled to life again, causing both men to freeze. The same voice, the same professional tone, but with additional information that made Jules's blood run cold. "Raven 49er, Black Ridge Grid, ETA 0500 hours. Request. Clearance for landing." Carson grabbed the microphone before Jules could stop him. "Raven 49er, this is Black Ridge Control. State your current position and authorization code." The response came immediately, delivered with the kind of calm authority that suggested the speaker had been expecting the challenge. "Black Ridge Control, current position classified. Authorization code ... There isn't one. Some of us were never supposed to come home." Carson looked at Jules with the expression of someone who just stepped into quicksand. The transmission had answered one question while raising a dozen others. If this was really Eliza, then her return represented a security breach of unprecedented magnitude. If it wasn't, then someone had access to classified information that should have been impossible to obtain. General Morrison arrived within minutes, his gray hair disheveled and his eyes sharp with the kind of alertness that came from 30 years of military service and surprises that could topple governments. He was followed by Colonel Banks, the base security chief, and Dr. Amanda Walsh, the staff psychologist who specialized in post-traumatic stress and prisoner reintegration. The communications room suddenly felt crowded with authority figures, who were all asking the same unspoken question. How do you prepare for the return of a soldier who's been dead for 7 years? Morrison listened to the recordings twice, his expression revealing nothing. He'd been the one to deliver the news of Eliza's death to her family, the one to recommend her for posthumous honors, the one to sign the paperwork that officially ended her existence. "Is this a breach?" he demanded, his voice carrying the weight of command. "A spoof signal? Is she compromised?" No one had answers. The technical analysis was solid, but dead people didn't make radio calls. The encryption keys were authentic, but those should have been destroyed years ago. The voice pattern matched, but voice synthesis technology had advanced considerably since Eliza's supposed death. Could be enemy intelligence, Colonel Banks suggested. They could have captured her, turned her, used her as an asset for 7 years. Morrison shook his head. That's a hell of a long game. The room fell silent, except for the hum of electronics and the distant sound of early morning aircraft operations. Everyone present understood the implications. If Eliza had been captured and compromised, her return could represent a catastrophic security breach. If she'd been operating independently for 7 years, her intelligence value could be beyond measure. If this was some kind of elaborate deception, then they were dealing with an enemy who understood their operations at a level that should have been impossible. But deep down, everyone in that room knew the truth they were afraid to speak. Eliza had been one of the sharpest forward operatives in special reconnaissance, trained to disappear into hostile territory for months at a time, built to survive on nothing but instinct and the kind of stubborn refusal to die that made legends. If anyone could fake their own death and survive off-grid for 7 years, it was her. The communications room had transformed into an impromptu command center, with senior officers huddled around banks of radio equipment like generals planning a siege. General Morrison stood at the center of the controlled chaos, his weathered face betraying none of the uncertainty that Jules could see in his eyes. The man who delivered Eliza's eulogy to her family was now faced with the possibility that his words had been premature. "Do not engage," Morrison ordered, his voice cutting through the murmur of worried conversations. "But maintain full monitoring, run blackout protocol, complete security sweep of the perimeter. Let's see who lands." Jules watched the transformation of Black Ridge Base from his position at the communications console. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. Security teams moving to strategic positions, snipers taking their posts, medical personnel preparing for scenarios that ranged from wounded soldier to hostile infiltrator. Sometimes silence was louder than sirens, and the absence of obvious activity made the tension even more palpable. Colonel Banks coordinated the security response with the efficiency of someone who'd prepared for every possible threat except this one. How do you establish a perimeter against a ghost? How do you prepare for the return of someone who wasn't supposed to exist? "Medical team to standby," Dr. Walsh spoke into her radio, her voice professionally calm despite the circumstances. "Unknown. Condition: possible psychological trauma. Possible hostile contact. Prepare for full evaluation." Jules remained at his station, monitoring the frequency that had been silent for 7 years until tonight. The minutes crawled by like hours, each second stretching into eternity. At 0-4-50-5, the radio crackled to life one final time. Raven 49er on approach. "Black Ridge, this is coming home." Morrison closed his eyes, recognizing something in those words that went beyond voice analysis and technical verification. It was the tone, the way she said, "coming home," like she'd been away on a weekend trip instead of dead for 7 years. That casual confidence had been Eliza's trademark, the ability to remain calm in situations that would paralyze most people. "Open the gates," Morrison ordered quietly. "Full security detail, medical team on standby, and someone get me a psychiatrist. We're gonna need one." The room erupted in controlled chaos as personnel moved to execute orders that defied every regulation and protocol they'd ever learned. Because sometimes the impossible walked through your front door and demanded to be real. And all you could do was open the door and see what walked through. Jules felt a strange mixture of vindication and terror. He'd been right about the signals, right about the patterns he'd detected over the years. But being right didn't make this any less surreal. He'd spent 7 years maintaining a digital vigil for someone who was supposed to be dead, and now that vigil was about to end. The outer perimeter guards reported contact at exactly 0-4-50-7. A single vehicle approaching from the east, traveling without lights through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate in darkness. The description came through in fragments: dusty black Humvee. No license plates, no escort, no paperwork. Security cameras tracked the vehicle as it approached the main gate. The image quality was poor in the pre-dawn darkness, but Jules could make out enough details to increase his anxiety. The Humvee looked like it had driven through 7 years of war zones, desert storms, and impossible terrain. Battle-scarred, patched with repairs that spoke of field maintenance and desperate improvisation. Single occupant, the gate guard reported. Individual requesting entry. Claims to be ... A pause, as if the guard couldn't quite bring himself to say the words. Claims to be Captain Eliza Raven. Morrison keyed his radio. Let her through. Escort to the communications building. No weapons drawn, but maintain ready position. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity and anticipation. Jules watched the security monitors as the Humvee passed through the gate, noting how it moved with the confident navigation of someone who knew the base layout intimately. The vehicle didn't hesitate at intersections, didn't slow down to read signs or check directions. It moved like it was coming home. She stepped out of the Humvee slowly, deliberately, like someone who'd learned that sudden movements could mean death. Same build, lean, athletic, carved from years of physical training. Same posture alert, but relaxed, ready for anything. Hair tied back in a practical ponytail, streaked with premature gray that hadn't been there 7 years ago. But it was her eyes that convinced Jules. Ice blue, sharp with intelligence and shadowed with experiences that couldn't be faked. Those were the eyes of someone who'd seen too much and forgotten nothing. Eliza didn't speak to the guards, didn't explain herself, didn't offer identification or apologies or explanations. She walked straight to the communications building, past stunned MPs and speechless officers who stepped aside without being asked. Her boots made no sound on the concrete, and Jules realized she was moving with the careful silence of someone who'd spent years avoiding detection. At the security desk, the guard, a young corporal who'd been stationed at Black Ridge for 2 years, stammered through his training. "Ma'am, I need to see some identification." Eliza reached into her jacket and placed something on the desk. Jules couldn't see what it was from his position, but he could see the corporal's face go pale as he examined it. "Ma'am, this says you're dead," the corporal said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eliza's response was delivered with the kind of dry humor that Jules remembered from her briefings. "Yeah, I got that memo." Upstairs in the communications room, the tension was approaching breaking point. General Morrison waited with his senior staff, watching the security monitors and trying to prepare for a conversation that had no precedent in military protocol. How do you debrief a soldier who's been dead for 7 years? How do you determine if someone is genuine or compromised when their very existence defies explanation? Dr. Walsh reviewed her notes on post-traumatic stress and prisoner reintegration, but none of her training had prepared her for this scenario. 7 years of captivity could break anyone, but 7 years of independent operation could be even more psychologically damaging. The isolation, the constant danger, the need to maintain cover identities. It was a recipe for complete personality fragmentation. Colonel Banks checked his sidearm for the 3rd time, his military training warring with his human curiosity. Part of him wanted to believe that Eliza had survived, that one of their finest operatives had somehow found a way to cheat death. But another part of him knew that enemy intelligence services were capable of extraordinary deception, and that this could be the most sophisticated infiltration attempt in military history. The footsteps on the stairs were measured and confident, approaching with the steady rhythm of someone who'd climbed these steps many times before. Jules found himself holding his breath, waiting for the moment when speculation would become reality. The door opened without ceremony, and Eliza walked into the room like she'd never left. 7 years of questions and uncertainty crystallized into a single moment of recognition. She was older, more weathered, marked by experiences that had left. There are traces in the lines around her eyes and the set of her shoulders. But it was unmistakably her. Morrison didn't stand when she entered, but he didn't look away either. The room held its breath, waiting for someone to speak first, to break the silence that had lasted 7 years. "You're not supposed to exist," Morrison said finally, his voice carrying the weight of official pronouncement and personal disbelief. Eliza's response was delivered with the calm authority that Jules remembered from 100 mission briefings. "Good, then no one will ask where I've been." She reached into her jacket and placed a sealed flash drive on the conference table. The small device landed with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence, a sound that would mark the end of one mystery and the beginning of another. The war room had seen its share of classified briefings, intelligence reports, and strategic planning sessions. But none of those had prepared the officers present for this moment, the return of a soldier who'd been mourned, honored, and officially forgotten, carrying intelligence that could change everything they thought they knew about their enemies and their allies. The flash drive sat on the conference table like a small black monument to 7 years of unanswered questions. Everyone in the room stared at it, understanding that whatever information it contained would fundamentally alter their understanding of the Kashmir operation and everything that had followed. General Morrison leaned forward, his weathered hands folded on the table. "What's on that drive, Captain?" Eliza's response was delivered with the kind of quiet certainty that came from someone who'd spent years collecting evidence for this moment. "Everything we missed, every connection we failed to make, every assumption that got good soldiers killed." Colonel Banks couldn't contain his suspicion any longer. 7 years, Raven. 7 years of no contact, no reports, no indication you were alive. Where the hell have you been? Eliza looked around the room, taking in the faces of officers who had served with her, commanded her, trusted her with their lives and their secrets. Some were familiar, others were new assignments who'd arrived after her supposed death. All of them were struggling with the same fundamental question: how do you verify the identity of a ghost? "I've been everywhere that doesn't exist on your maps," she said simply. Following leads that couldn't be pursued through official channels. Building relationships with people who shoot strangers for sport. Learning things that can only be learned by someone who's supposed to be dead. Dr. Walsh activated her digital recorder, her training kicking in despite the unprecedented nature of the situation. "Captain, I need to ask about your mental state. 7 years of isolation, of living under assumed identities, of constant danger. That level of psychological stress can cause significant trauma." Eliza's smile was devoid of humor. "Doctor, I've been shot, stabbed, tortured, and left for dead more times than I can count. I've killed people whose names I'll never know to protect secrets I couldn't share. I've lived in caves, abandoned buildings, and refugee camps. I've eaten things that would make you vomit and slept in places that would give you nightmares. But I've never been more certain of my mission or my sanity." Morrison studied her face, looking for signs of deception or psychological breakdown. What he saw was harder to categorize: exhaustion mixed with determination, grief shadowed by something that might have been relief. "Why come back now?" he asked. "If you've been operating independently for 7 years, what's changed?" Eliza's expression grew serious, and for the first time since entering the room, she showed a trace of the emotional weight she'd been carrying. "Because the war isn't over, General. Because what I learned out there, it's bigger than whatever reasons I had for staying gone. And because if I don't share this intelligence now, more good soldiers are going to die for the wrong reasons." She gestured toward the flash drive. That contained 7 years of intelligence gathering. Names, dates, financial records, communications intercepts, photographs, evidence of a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of military command, government agencies and defense contractors. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. If Elijah was telling the truth, then the Kashmir operation hadn't been a simple reconnaissance mission gone wrong. It had been something far more complex, with consequences that had rippled through 7 years of military and intelligence operations. Colonel Banks reached for the flash drive, then stopped. If we access this information, what are we going to find? Eliza's response was delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that made everyone in the room lean forward. You're going to find out that the Kashmir operation was compromised before we ever left the base. You're going to find out that someone wanted us dead, and they nearly succeeded. And you're going to find out that the enemy we've been fighting for 7 years isn't the only enemy we need to worry about. Jules had been silent throughout the exchange, but now he spoke up from his position at the communications console. Captain, the signals we've been detecting over the years, were those from you? Eliza nodded. I needed to know that this frequency was still active, that someone was still listening. I couldn't risk direct contact until I had enough evidence to prove what really happened in Kashmir. Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He reached for the flash drive, his expression grim with the understanding that some knowledge came with a price that couldn't be calculated in advance. Colonel Banks, clear the room except for essential personnel. Dr. Walsh, I need you to conduct a full psychological evaluation, but not until after we've reviewed this intelligence. Sergeant Martinez, maintain communication blackout until further notice. As the room emptied, leaving only Morrison, Banks, Walsh, Jules, and Eliza, the general connected the flash drive to a secure computer system. The files that appeared on screen were organized with military precision folders labeled by date, location, and classification level. It was the work of someone who understood intelligence protocols and had spent years building a comprehensive case. Morrison opened the first file, labeled Kashmir Operation Initial Briefing. What he found was a recording of the original mission briefing, but with additional information that hadn't been included in the official version. References to intelligence assets who weren't supposed to exist, authorization codes that didn't match the official records, and financial transactions that suggested the operation had been funded through unofficial channels. This is impossible, Banks muttered, studying the documentation. These files show planning that went back months before the official mission approval. How did you get access to this information? Eliza's response was delivered with the kind of quiet authority that came from someone who'd spent years verifying every detail. I got it from the people who planned to kill us. Turns out, enemy intelligence services keep excellent records. They wanted to make sure they could prove their success to their superiors. The next file contained photographs that made everyone in the room go silent. Images of the Kashmir compound, taken from multiple angles, detailed floor plans, guard rotations, and tactical assessments. But these weren't reconnaissance photos. They were intelligence packages prepared for an ambush. Someone gave them our insertion point, Eliza said quietly. Our equipment loadout, our communication frequencies, our extraction timeline. They knew exactly when and where we'd be vulnerable. Morrison felt the weight of 7 years of guilt and uncertainty settling on his shoulders. He'd been the one to approve the mission, the one to sign the orders that had sent 4 soldiers into a trap. The official investigation had concluded that the operation had been compromised through bad intelligence or operational security failures. But this evidence suggested something far more deliberate and far more dangerous. Dr. Walsh studied the psychological profile that was emerging from Eliza's account. 7 years of living with the knowledge that she'd been betrayed by someone in her own command structure. 7 years of surviving in hostile territory while building a case against the people who tried to kill her. It was a level of sustained psychological stress that should have caused complete breakdown, but instead seemed to have forged someone even stronger and more determined. "Captain," Walsh said carefully, "the level of paranoia and mistrust required to survive what you've described, how do we know that hasn't affected your ability to evaluate evidence objectively?" Eliza's smile was sharp as a blade. "Doctor, paranoia isn't paranoia if they're really trying to kill you. And trust isn't trust if it gets you shot in the back. I spent 7 years learning to distinguish between healthy suspicion and psychological breakdown. The evidence speaks for itself." The files continued to reveal a pattern of betrayal that reached beyond the Kashmir operation. Intelligence reports that had been altered before transmission, military operations that had been compromised by security breaches, defense contractors who were selling information to enemy agents. It was a conspiracy that had been operating for years, using the cover of legitimate military operations to advance enemy interests. Jules studied the communication intercepts, his technical expertise allowing him to verify the authenticity of the encrypted messages. The evidence was overwhelming. Someone with access to the highest levels of military intelligence had been systematically betraying American operations for years. "Who?" Morrison asked, his voice hoarse with the weight of betrayal. "Who's behind this?" Eliza opened the final file, labeled Blackwater Analysis Command Structure. The document contained detailed profiles of military officers, intelligence agents, and government officials who had been identified as participants in the conspiracy. The names were familiar, respected figures in the military and intelligence communities. People who had been trusted with the most sensitive operations and the most classified information. But it was the final name on the list that made everyone in the room go silent. Colonel Marcus Webb, the former base commander at Black Ridge. The man who had personally approved the Kashmir operation and signed the orders that had sent Eliza's team into the mountains. Webb had been promoted to the Pentagon 3 years earlier, where he now served as a senior advisor on special operations. He had access to classified operations across multiple theaters, influence over mission planning and resource allocation, and the trust of the highest levels of military command. "Webb," Morrison said quietly, the name carrying the weight of 7 years of betrayal. "Marcus Webb," Eliza nodded. "He's been selling intelligence to enemy agents for at least 8 years. The Kashmir operation was just one of many that he compromised. But it was the first one where someone survived to document what really happened." The room fell silent as the implications of this revelation settled over them. Webb wasn't just a traitor. He was a traitor with access to ongoing operations, current intelligence, and the ability to compromise future missions. Every classified briefing he attended, every strategic planning session he participated in, every operation he had knowledge of was potentially compromised. But proving his guilt and bringing him to justice would require more than just intelligence, gathered by a soldier who was supposed to be dead. It would require a careful, methodical approach that could survive legal scrutiny and political interference. Morrison closed the files and looked at Eliza with the expression of someone who'd just been handed both salvation and damnation. "What do you need from us?" Eliza's response was delivered with the kind of quiet determination that had kept her alive for 7 years. "I need you to trust me one more time, General. I need you to let me finish what I started in Kashmir. And I need you to be prepared for the possibility that Webb isn't the only one." For 72 hours, Eliza was held in a secure facility that officially didn't exist on any base documentation. The building was listed as a storage warehouse, but behind its unremarkable exterior lay a complex of rooms designed for housing personnel who couldn't be processed through normal military channels. Defectors, deep cover agents, and now, apparently, soldiers who'd returned from the dead. Dr. Walsh conducted her evaluation in a sterile room that reminded Jules of an interrogation chamber. He watched through one-way glass as Eliza submitted to psychological testing, medical examination, and endless questions about her 7 years in the wilderness. The woman who emerged from those sessions was remarkably composed for someone who should have been psychologically shattered. The medical examination revealed old wounds that had healed without proper treatment, bullet scars, knife cuts, evidence of torture that had been endured and survived. Her body told the story of 7 years spent in constant danger, but her mind remained sharp and focused. Every answer she gave was brief, precise, and impossible to disprove. "Where were you operating?" Dr. Walsh asked during one session. "Moving," Eliza replied simply. "Who did you work for?" "Myself." "How did you survive financially?" "Carefully." "Why come back now?" "Because the war isn't over." Jules found himself admiring her tactical approach to the interrogation. She was giving them enough information to verify her identity and establish her credibility, while revealing nothing that could compromise whatever network she built during her years of independent operation. General Morrison spent those 72 hours reviewing the intelligence on the flash drive with a team of analysts who'd been cleared for the highest levels of classified information. What they found made seasoned intelligence officers question everything they thought they knew about enemy capabilities and friendly security. The conspiracy wasn't limited to Colonel Webb. The files revealed a network of compromised personnel that reached across multiple branches of the military, intelligence agencies, and defense contractors. Financial records showed payments flowing from shell companies linked to enemy intelligence services to bank accounts controlled by American officials. Communication intercepts documented coordination between hostile agents and personnel with access to classified military operations. But the most damaging revelation was the scope of the betrayal. Operations across 3 different theaters had been compromised over the past 8 years. Intelligence assets had been identified and eliminated. Military personnel had been killed in ambushes that should have been impossible to predict. Strategic plans had been anticipated and countered before they could be implemented. Colonel Banks coordinated a discreet investigation that couldn't be detected by the subjects under scrutiny. It was a delicate operation. They needed to verify Eliza's intelligence without alerting the conspirators that their activities had been discovered. Phone records were analyzed, financial transactions were traced, and travel patterns were mapped. Each piece of evidence confirmed another aspect of Eliza's accusations. The breakthrough came when Jules detected something unusual in the communication logs. Webb had been making encrypted calls to a secure number that wasn't listed in any official directory. The frequency of those calls had increased dramatically over the past 6 months, suggesting that whatever operation he was supporting was approaching a critical phase. "He's planning something," Jules reported to Morrison during a classified briefing. "The communication pattern suggests coordination for a major operation. Based on the timing and frequency, I'd estimate they're preparing for something within the next 2 weeks." Morrison studied the analysis with the grim expression of someone who'd spent 30 years learning to recognize genuine threats. "What kind of operation?" "Unknown, sir. But based on the participants and the level of security, it's something significant. Something that would require advanced intelligence about our defensive capabilities and response protocols." The implications were staggering. If Webb was coordinating with enemy agents for a major operation, then American military personnel could be walking into another trap. The Kashmir incident could be repeated on a larger scale, with consequences that could destabilize entire theaters of operation. But proving Webb's guilt and stopping whatever operation he was planning would require evidence that could survive legal scrutiny. Eliza's intelligence was compelling, but it had been gathered through methods that couldn't be officially acknowledged. They needed additional verification, and they needed it quickly. Morrison made a decision that violated several regulations and potentially compromised his career. He authorized Eliza's temporary release from the secure facility with the understanding that she would work under deep cover to gather additional evidence against Webb and his network. "I can't officially sanction this operation," he told her during their final meeting. "If you're discovered, we'll have to disavow any knowledge of your activities. If you're captured, we can't guarantee extraction or support." Eliza's response carried the weight of 7 years spent operating without official backup or recognition. "General, I've been disavowed for 7 years. I've been captured, tortured, and left for dead. I've operated without support, without resources, and without hope of rescue. But I've never stopped serving my country, and I'm not going to start now." Jules was assigned to maintain communication support for the operation, though his role would be carefully concealed from official oversight. He established a secure communication protocol that would allow Eliza to transmit intelligence without revealing her location or compromising the investigation. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Eliza would use her official death status to move freely through channels that would be impossible for active military personnel to access. She could make contact with hostile agents without raising suspicion, gather evidence of their activities, and document their connections to compromised American officials. But the plan required her to return to the shadows, to become a ghost once again. After 72 hours of existing officially, she would disappear back into the world of assumed identities and manufactured histories. "How long?" Morrison asked, as she prepared to leave. "As long as it takes," Eliza replied. "But based on their communication patterns, I'd estimate 2 weeks before they make their move. I'll need that time to identify their targets and gather enough evidence to stop them." Jules watched her walk away from Black Ridge Base for the second time in 7 years. But this time, he knew she would be coming back. This time, he would be listening for her voice on frequencies that didn't officially exist, waiting for intelligence that could save American lives and expose a conspiracy that threatened the security of the entire military command structure. The war room fell silent after her departure, but it was a different kind of silence than they'd experienced before. Not the silence of death and loss, but the silence of anticipation. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the base perimeter, one of their finest operatives was beginning a mission that would either vindicate 7 years of sacrifice or cost her everything she'd worked to accomplish. Morrison returned to his office and stared at the official casualty reports that still listed Captain Eliza Raven as killed in action. Her name remained on the memorial wall, black granite letters that would forever mark her as one of the fallen. But now those letters represented something different. Not death, but transformation. Not loss, but sacrifice. The next 2 weeks would determine whether that sacrifice had been worthwhile, whether 7 years of living in the shadows would finally bring the truth into the light, and whether one soldier's refusal to accept death would be enough to save others from the same fate. Webb's movements over the following week revealed a pattern that confirmed Eliza's worst suspicions. The Pentagon official who'd sent her team into the Kashmir trap was now coordinating something far more ambitious and far more dangerous. Jules tracked his communications from the secure facility at Black Ridge, noting the increase in encrypted transmissions and the involvement of personnel who shouldn't have been part of any legitimate operation. Eliza had vanished into the urban landscape of Washington, D.C., using skills honed over 7 years of survival to blend into the background of government workers, contractors, and support personnel who kept the military-industrial complex functioning. Her appearance had been subtly altered, different hair color, contact lenses that changed her eye color, clothing that suggested a mid-level bureaucrat rather than a special operations veteran. She'd established herself as Rebecca Johnson, a defense contractor analyst with credentials that would pass casual inspection but wouldn't survive deep background investigation. The identity was temporary, designed to last just long enough to get close to Webb's operation without triggering security protocols. The breakthrough came when she identified Webb's primary contact, a man named Viktor Petrov, who claimed to be a cultural attaché at the Russian embassy, but was actually a senior intelligence officer with connections to terrorist organizations across 3 continents. Their meetings were carefully orchestrated, held in locations that provided natural cover for surveillance and conversation. Eliza positioned herself in a coffee shop across from the Smithsonian Museum, using a directional microphone disguised as a hearing aid to capture their conversation. What she heard made her blood run cold. "The operation is approved for next Tuesday," Webb said, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone discussing routine business. 3 simultaneous strikes against military installations. Casualties are expected to be significant. Petrov's response was delivered with the kind of professional detachment that suggested he'd planned similar operations before. "Our assets are in position. The intelligence you've provided about their security protocols has been invaluable. They won't know what hit them until it's too late." Webb leaned forward, his expression serious. "I need to know that my involvement won't be discovered. If this gets traced back to me, ... Relax, Colonel. You'll be in meetings at the Pentagon when the attacks occur. Perfect alibi. And the evidence will point to intelligence failures, not internal betrayal. Your career will survive, probably even benefit from the crisis." Eliza felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied the moment when surveillance became actionable intelligence. She had confirmation of Webb's betrayal, details about the planned attacks, and evidence of foreign coordination. But she also had less than 5 days to prevent a terrorist operation that could kill hundreds of American military personnel. She transmitted her findings to Jules using a coded message embedded in a routine email about defense contractor services. To anyone monitoring the communication, it would appear to be bureaucratic correspondence. But Jules would recognize the embedded code that revealed the location, timing, and scope of the planned attacks. The response came within hours, transmitted through the same covert channel. Morrison had authorized immediate action, but with the understanding that official support would be impossible. The evidence against Webb was compelling, but it had been gathered through methods that couldn't be acknowledged in court. Any attempt to arrest him or prevent the attacks through official channels would alert his handlers and potentially trigger the operation early. Eliza was on her own, just as she'd been for 7 years. She spent the next 48 hours conducting surveillance on the 3 target locations Webb had mentioned: Naval Station Norfolk in Virginia, Fort Carson in Colorado, and Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton in California. All were major installations with significant personnel populations, exactly the kind of targets that would generate maximum casualties and psychological impact. The attack plan was sophisticated and coordinated. Teams of operatives have been positioned near each installation, using legitimate business covers to explain their presence in the area. They were professionals, trained in tactics that suggested military or intelligence backgrounds, not the kind of amateur terrorists who could be stopped by enhanced security measures or routine surveillance. But Eliza had one advantage that their planning hadn't anticipated. She knew they were coming. She identified the team leader at Norfolk, a man named Hassan, who claimed to be an engineering consultant, but whose background research revealed connections to several international terrorist organizations. His team had rented a warehouse near the base perimeter, ostensibly for storage of construction equipment, but actually for staging their assault. Eliza began systematic harassment of their operation, using techniques she'd perfected during 7 years of disrupting enemy activities. Equipment failures that appeared accidental, but prevented them from testing their weapons. Supply deliveries that were delayed or misdirected. Communication systems that experienced mysterious interference. The team at Fort Carson received similar attention. Their vehicle broke down repeatedly, forcing them to delay their timeline. Their surveillance equipment malfunctioned. Key personnel developed food poisoning that left them incapacitated for crucial planning periods. At Camp Pendleton, Eliza took a more direct approach. She infiltrated their safe house during the team's absence and planted evidence that suggested one of their operatives was working for American intelligence. The paranoia and suspicion that followed effectively paralyzed their decision-making process. But individual sabotage wouldn't be enough to stop the coordinated attack. She needed to expose Webb's role and provide law enforcement with evidence that would justify immediate action against all 3 teams. The solution came when she intercepted Webb's final coordination call with Petrov. The conversation took place in Webb's Pentagon office, using a secure phone line that was supposed to be impossible to monitor. But Eliza had spent 7 years learning that impossible was simply another word for difficult. She'd gained access to the Pentagon through her Rebecca Johnson identity, claiming to have a scheduled meeting with defense contractor liaisons. Her real purpose was to install a listening device in Webb's office, but the timing had to be perfect. Security sweeps were conducted regularly, and any unauthorized equipment would be discovered quickly. The device she planted was smaller than a coin and designed to transmit for only 72 hours before self-destructing. But those 72 hours would be enough to capture Webb's final communications with his handlers. The recording she obtained was devastating. Webb not only confirmed his role in planning the attacks, but revealed details about other operations he'd compromised over the years. The Kashmir mission, the deaths of intelligence assets, the strategic plans that had been anticipated and countered by enemy forces. It was a comprehensive confession delivered to someone he trusted completely. But as Eliza prepared to transmit the evidence to Morrison, she realized she was being watched. Petrov had noticed the subtle signs of surveillance and had initiated counterintelligence measures. Her Rebecca Johnson identity was being investigated, and it wouldn't survive professional scrutiny. She had perhaps 6 hours before her cover was blown, and Webb's operation went into emergency activation. 6 hours to transmit the evidence, coordinate with law enforcement, and escape before enemy agents realized that their 7-year-old problem had returned from the dead. Jules received her transmission at exactly 2300 hours, 5 days after Webb's meeting at the Smithsonian. The audio file was embedded in what appeared to be a routine software update, but the embedded message was clear. Webb's confession, the attack timeline, and the locations of all 3 terrorist teams. Morrison was awakened at his quarters and briefed within minutes. The evidence was overwhelming, but the timeline was impossibly tight. Coordinating law enforcement response across 3 states while maintaining operational security would require resources and authority that stretched the boundaries of military jurisdiction. But some decisions couldn't wait for proper authorization or bureaucratic approval. Sometimes protecting American lives required officers to exceed their authority and accept the consequences later. Morrison activated emergency protocols that hadn't been used since the September 11th attacks. FBI counterterrorism units were alerted. Local law enforcement was briefed, and military security at all 3 installations was increased to maximum alert status. The official explanation was intelligence indicating potential terrorist activity, but the real reason was one soldier's 7-year investigation into betrayal at the highest levels. Webb was arrested at his Pentagon office 6 hours before the planned attacks charged with treason, espionage, and conspiracy to commit terrorism. The evidence against him was so overwhelming that his handlers immediately abandoned any attempt at rescue or extraction. The 3 terrorist teams were apprehended before they could implement their assault plans. Hassan and his Norfolk team were surrounded at their warehouse, finding themselves facing a coordinated response that had anticipated their every move. The Fort Carson and Camp Pendleton teams surrendered without resistance when they realized their operation had been completely compromised. But Eliza wasn't among those apprehended. By the time law enforcement arrived at the location she'd been surveilling, she had vanished once again into the urban landscape that had concealed her for 7 years. Jules monitored the communication frequencies for any sign of her presence, but the channels remained silent. She had accomplished her mission, provided the evidence needed to stop a major terrorist operation, and exposed a conspiracy that had compromised American security for nearly a decade. But the cost of that success was a return to the shadows, to the world of assumed identities and manufactured histories that had kept her alive but isolated from everything she'd once called home. The official reports would credit enhanced intelligence capabilities and improved interagency cooperation for preventing the attacks. Webb's arrest would be explained as the result of routine security investigations that had uncovered evidence of espionage. No mention would be made of a soldier who'd spent 7 years gathering evidence for this moment, who'd sacrificed everything to serve a country that couldn't officially acknowledge her existence. The secure conference room at the Pentagon had hosted countless classified briefings over the decades, but none quite like this one. General Morrison sat across from Colonel Webb, studying the man who'd sent 4 soldiers to their deaths and planned to kill hundreds more. Webb's hands were cuffed to the table, his uniform stripped of rank insignia, his career destroyed by the evidence that filled 3 separate files. Webb still carried himself with military bearing, but his eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd realized that 7 years of careful planning had been undone by a soldier who was supposed to be dead. The interrogation had been proceeding for 6 hours, and he'd maintained his innocence despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. "I want to understand the Kashmir operation," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of official authority and personal betrayal. 4 soldiers under my command, sent into a trap that you helped plan. I want to know why. Webb's response was delivered with the kind of professional detachment that made Morrison's blood run cold. Operational casualties are inevitable in special reconnaissance missions. The intelligence suggested the location was compromised, but the mission parameters required accepting elevated risk. "The intelligence came from you," Morrison replied. "Your sources, your assessment, your recommendation to proceed despite security concerns. And now we know those sources were working for enemy intelligence services." Webb shifted in his chair, the handcuffs rattling against the metal table. "You can't prove deliberate betrayal. Intelligence failures happen. Assessment errors occur. The burden of proof requires more than circumstantial evidence and theoretical connections." Morrison opened the first file and spread photographs across the table. Images of the Kashmir compound, taken from multiple angles, detailed floor plans, guard rotations, and tactical assessments. Not reconnaissance photos, but intelligence packages prepared for an ambush. "These were taken from your contact's personal files," Morrison said. "Viktor Petrov kept excellent records of his operations, including detailed documentation of how he coordinated with compromised American officials to eliminate threats to their intelligence networks." Webb studied the photographs without expression, but Morrison caught the slight tensing of muscles around his eyes. Recognition, followed by calculation, followed by the realization that denial was no longer possible. Captain Raven was investigating arms trafficking networks that connected to some very sensitive operations, Webb said finally. Her activities threatened to expose relationships that were crucial to American intelligence gathering in the region. Sometimes protecting the larger mission requires sacrificing individual assets. Morrison felt the last of his professional restraint evaporate. You sold out your own soldiers to protect arms dealers and terrorist financiers. You sent 4 people to their deaths because their investigation threatened your profit margins. Webb's facade finally cracked, revealing the cold calculation that had guided 7 years of betrayal. You think this is about money? You think I compromised operations for personal gain? This is about strategic necessity, about accepting uncomfortable realities in service of larger objectives. What larger objectives? Morrison demanded. What strategic necessity justifies betraying American soldiers to enemy agents? Webb leaned forward, his voice dropping to the whisper that suggested he was about to reveal secrets that could destroy careers and topple governments. We've been fighting the wrong war, General, focusing on obvious enemies while ignoring the real threats. Some of us have been working to redirect American military resources toward targets that actually matter. Morrison felt the pieces of a larger conspiracy beginning to fall into place. You've been deliberately compromising operations to justify increased military spending and expanded surveillance programs, creating failures to support your own political agenda. Webb's smile was devoid of warmth or humanity. I've been serving American interests in ways that you lack the vision to understand. Sometimes protection requires collaboration with entities that appear hostile but share common objectives. The interrogation continued for another hour, but Webb revealed nothing more of substance. His admissions were carefully calibrated to acknowledge guilt while suggesting that his actions had been motivated by patriotism rather than greed or ideology. It was the defense of someone who'd spent years preparing for this moment, who understood that perception would matter more than truth in determining his ultimate fate. But Morrison had one more card to play, one piece of evidence that Webb couldn't have prepared for because he believed his source was dead. There's someone here who wants to speak with you, Morrison said, activating the intercom system. Someone who survived your Kashmir operation and spent 7 years documenting your betrayal. The door opened, and Eliza walked into the room. Webb's reaction was immediate and visceral. His face went pale. His hands trembled against the handcuffs. And for the first time during the interrogation, his professional composure completely collapsed. "That's impossible," he whispered. "You're dead." The reports confirmed the blood evidence, the drone reconnaissance. Eliza sat down across from him, her ice blue eyes holding his gaze with the kind of intensity that came from 7 years of planning for this moment. "Hello, Marcus, miss me?" Webb stared at her as if she were a ghost made manifest, which in many ways she was. The woman he'd tried to kill had returned to confront him with evidence of his crimes and testimony that would ensure his conviction. "The Kashmir operation," Eliza said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that Morrison remembered from her mission briefings. "You told us the intelligence was solid, that the compound was lightly defended, that we'd have tactical surprise. But you knew we were walking into an ambush." Webb found his voice, though it carried none of its former confidence. The intelligence was the best available. Assessment indicated acceptable risk parameters for mission objectives. Eliza smiled, and the expression was sharp enough to cut glass. "Marcus, I spent 7 years living with the people who killed my team. I learned their language, earned their trust, and eventually gained access to their operational records. They showed me the intelligence packages you provided. Communication frequencies, insertion timing, equipment loadouts. You gave them everything. They needed to plan our deaths." She reached into her jacket and placed a digital recorder on the table. "This contains testimony from Hassan al-Rashid, one of your primary contacts. He's quite proud of the Kashmir operation. Considers it a masterpiece. of intelligence coordination. He was very detailed in describing how you provided advance warning of our mission. Webb's breathing became shallow, his face flushed with the realization that his crimes had been documented by the very people he'd collaborated with. Any recordings obtained through illegal interrogation would be inadmissible in court. Testimony extracted under duress has no legal standing. Eliza's laugh was devoid of humor. Who said anything about interrogation? Hassan shared this information voluntarily during a celebration dinner in Damascus 3 years ago. He was drunk, proud, and eager to impress his colleagues with stories of successful operations. I was serving wine at that dinner, invisible in the way that service staff always are. She activated the recorder, and Hassan's voice filled the room, speaking in accented English about the American colonel who provided intelligence for the Kashmir ambush. The recording was clear, detailed, and utterly damning. Webb listened to his own betrayal being described with pride and satisfaction by someone he trusted with American lives. His shoulders sagged as the weight of 7 years of guilt and deception finally broke through his defenses. "Why?" Morrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why betray your own people?" Webb's response was delivered with the broken voice of someone who'd finally run out of justifications and rationalizations. "Because the system is broken. Because we're fighting wars that can't be won through conventional means. Because sometimes you have to collaborate with your enemies to protect your country from larger threats." Eliza leaned forward, her voice carrying the weight of 7 years in the wilderness. "Marcus, you didn't protect anyone. You got good soldiers killed to advance your own agenda. You compromised operations that could have saved lives. You turned American military resources into tools for terrorist organizations." Webb looked up at her with eyes that held the hollow recognition of complete defeat. "What happens now?" Morrison answered before Eliza could respond. "Now you face court-martial for treason, espionage, and conspiracy to commit terrorism. The evidence is overwhelming. The witnesses are credible, and the consequences are final. You'll spend the rest of your life in prison, assuming the death penalty isn't imposed." Webb nodded slowly, understanding that his career, his freedom, and his life had been forfeit the moment Eliza walked back through the gates of Black Ridge Base. But Eliza had one final revelation that would ensure justice was complete and comprehensive. "There's something else, Marcus. Something you need to know before this ends." She smiled, and for the first time, the expression held genuine warmth. "My team didn't all die in Kashmir. Rodriguez survived the initial ambush. I got him out, kept him alive for 2 years before enemy agents finally tracked us down. Before he died, he helped me understand how deep this conspiracy really goes." She placed another file on the table, this one containing evidence of Webb's other collaborators, other compromised operations, other betrayals that had cost American lives over nearly a decade. "This investigation isn't over, Marcus. You're just the beginning." Webb closed his eyes, finally understanding that his arrest was not the end of Eliza's 7-year mission, but simply the completion of its first phase. The woman he'd tried to kill had returned not just to expose his crimes, but to unravel an entire network of betrayal that reached into the highest levels of American military and intelligence operations. Justice had been delayed for 7 years, but it had not been denied. 6 months later, Jules stood in the communications room at Black Ridge Base, monitoring the same frequencies he'd maintained for over 8 years. But the silence was different now, not the hollow absence of loss, but the quiet satisfaction of completion. The conspiracy that had cost so many lives had been exposed, prosecuted, and dismantled. Webb's court-martial had lasted 3 weeks and resulted in a death sentence that was later commuted to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. The evidence Eliza had gathered over 7 years had proven overwhelming not just against Webb, but against the network of collaborators who'd supported his activities. 12 additional officers across 4 branches of the military had been arrested and convicted. 6 defense contractors had lost their security clearances and faced federal charges for selling classified information to foreign agents. 3. Government officials had resigned in disgrace when their connections to the conspiracy became public. But the most significant change had been the establishment of Project Griffin, an off-the-books reconnaissance and intelligence unit designed to identify and eliminate security threats that couldn't be addressed through conventional channels. It was based at a facility that officially didn't exist, staffed by personnel who maintained cover identities, and commanded by an officer whose death remained on the official records. General Morrison had recommended the project personally, though his final briefing to the Joint Chiefs contained only the most general details. Sometimes the best way to serve your country was to let it think you're dead, he'd written. Sometimes the most effective operations were those that never officially happened. Jules had been transferred to Project Griffin within a month of Webb's arrest. His official assignment listed as technical consulting for classified communication systems. His real role was maintaining contact with intelligence assets who operated in the gray areas between official military operations and covert activities. The assignment suited him perfectly. After 8 years of monitoring routine communications, he'd found purpose in supporting operations that mattered, that saved lives and protected American interests in ways that couldn't be measured or acknowledged publicly. Dr. Walsh had submitted her final psychological evaluation of Eliza with mixed conclusions. 7 years of isolation and constant danger had left psychological scars that would never fully heal, but they'd also forged someone with extraordinary resilience and adaptability. Her capacity for strategic thinking, her ability to maintain cover identities, and her skills in intelligence gathering were exceptional even by military standards. But it was her psychological stability that impressed Walsh the most. Someone who'd endured torture, betrayal, and 7 years of believing she was completely alone should have shown signs of paranoia, depression, or other stress-related disorders. Instead, Eliza demonstrated remarkable emotional balance and clear thinking. She's found peace with what she's become, Walsh had written in her final report. The isolation that should have broken her has instead given her clarity about her mission and her purpose. She's not the same person who entered the Kashmir Mountains 7 years ago, but she's exactly the person we need for the challenges we're facing. Eliza herself remained officially dead, her name still engraved on the memorial wall at Black Ridge Base. But those who knew the truth understood that the black granite letters now represented something different. Not death, but transformation. Not loss, but renewal. Project Griffin's first major operation had been the elimination of a terrorist financing network that stretched across 3 continents. The mission required deep cover insertion, long-term intelligence gathering, and coordination with assets who couldn't be acknowledged by any government. It was exactly the kind of operation that Eliza had been conducting independently for 7 years, but now with official support and resources. The operation had been successful beyond all expectations. Terrorist funding had been disrupted, key operatives had been eliminated, and intelligence had been gathered that prevented at least 6 planned attacks on American targets. But the most important result had been the validation of Eliza's approach to intelligence operations. Sometimes the most effective soldiers were those who didn't officially exist. Jules received the communication at 0400 hours on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 year after Eliza's return to Black Ridge Base. The transmission came through encrypted channels that weren't listed in any official directory, using protocols that had been established for Project Griffin operations. Griffin Base, this is Raven 49er. Mission complete. Coming home. The words carried the same calm authority Jules remembered from 7 years of monitoring her transmissions, but with something new underneath: satisfaction, perhaps, or simply relief. The voice of someone who'd accomplished what she'd set out to do and was ready to rest. Jules keyed the microphone, speaking words he'd waited 8 years to say. "Raven 49er, this is Griffin Base. Welcome home." The response came immediately, delivered with the kind of quiet humor that suggested some things never changed. "Griffin Base, it's good to be back among the living." 2 hours later, a dusty black Humvee rolled through the gates of the facility. That housed Project Griffin. The vehicle looked like it had driven through months of desert terrain, but its occupant stepped out with the confident bearing of someone who'd completed a successful mission. Eliza looked older, marked by experiences that had left their traces in the lines around her eyes and the careful way she moved. But her ice blue eyes held the steady gaze of someone who'd found peace with the choices she'd made and the prices she'd paid. General Morrison was waiting in the briefing room, along with Jules and the core staff of Project Griffin. The man who delivered Eliza's eulogy 7 years earlier now had the opportunity to welcome her back to the world of the living, even if that welcome couldn't be public or official. "How did it go?" Morrison asked as she placed a sealed flash drive on the conference table. Eliza's response was delivered with the kind of quiet satisfaction that came from completing a mission that had taken 8 years to plan and execute. "The network is gone, completely dismantled. Their financing has been disrupted, their leadership eliminated, and their operational capabilities destroyed. It'll take them at least 5 years to rebuild, assuming they can find anyone willing to take the risk." Morrison studied her face, noting the signs of exhaustion that suggested the mission had pushed even her remarkable capabilities to their limits. "And the cost?" Eliza's smile was tired but genuine. "Nothing we couldn't afford to pay. No American casualties, no compromise of ongoing operations, no exposure of intelligence assets. Clean operation from start to finish." Jules felt a surge of professional pride as he realized what she'd accomplished. The terrorist network that had been responsible for dozens of attacks over the past decade had been eliminated by a single operative working with minimal support and no official recognition. It was the kind of victory that would never be acknowledged publicly, but would save countless lives. But Morrison had one more question, the one that mattered most for the future of Project Griffin and the soldiers who would serve under Eliza's command. "What now, Captain? What's next for someone who spent 8 years in the shadows?" Eliza looked around the room, taking in the faces of people who'd supported her mission and maintained faith in her capabilities, even when the rest of the world believed she was dead. Her response was delivered with the kind of quiet determination that had kept her alive for 8 years. "Now we do it again, General. We find the next threat, the next network, the next group of people who think they can attack American interests without consequences. And we remind them that some soldiers are too stubborn to die and too dedicated to quit." Morrison nodded, understanding that Project Griffin had found its permanent commander. "Welcome home, Raven." Eliza's response was delivered with the first genuine laugh Jules had heard from her in 8 years. "It's good to be home, sir. Even if home is a place that doesn't officially exist." Outside, the memorial wall at Black Ridge Base continued to catch the morning light. Black granite letters that honored the fallen and remembered the lost. Captain Eliza Raven's name remained among them, a permanent reminder of sacrifice and service. But those who knew the truth understood that some legends refused to stay buried, that some soldiers served their country in ways that can't be measured or acknowledged, and that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to let them keep fighting. The war would continue, fought in shadows by people who didn't officially exist against enemies who thought they were safely hidden. But America would be defended by soldiers who'd learned that death was just another form of deep cover, and that the most effective operations were those that never officially happened. Jules returned to his monitoring station, maintaining watch over frequencies that carried the voices of soldiers who served in the gray areas between life and death, between official recognition and necessary denial. The silence was different. Now not empty, but full of possibility. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the base perimeter, Captain Eliza Raven was planning the next mission, gathering intelligence on the next threat, preparing to protect American lives in ways that would never be acknowledged or honored publicly. But for those who knew her story, who understood the price she'd paid and the sacrifices she'd made, her name on the memorial wall represented something more than death. It represented the kind of service that transcended official recognition, the kind of dedication that survived even the grave, and the kind of soldier who would never truly die as long as America needed defending. The legend of Raven 49er would live on, not in official records or public ceremonies, but in the quiet satisfaction of missions completed, threats eliminated, and American lives saved by someone who'd chosen to serve from beyond the edge of existence. Some soldiers are too stubborn to die. Some missions are too important to end. Some legends are too valuable to lose. Welcome home, Raven. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.